That'll be $500 for the unauthorized fence stain, another $1,000 for the unapproved mailbox, and we're going to need to talk about these trees, Mr. Miller. They are a clear violation of the Evergreen Estates Scenic View Covenant, Section 9, Paragraph 4". I stared at the woman standing on my property, her floral print muumuu straining against the humidity of a North Carolina summer. She held a clipboard like a scepter, a cheap pen clutched in her fist, and pointed it toward the ancient stand of longleaf pines that had stood on this land since before the United States was a country. Her name was Karen Swanson, and she was the self-appointed queen of the Homeowners Association next door, an entity to which I did not belong, had never belonged, and would rather set myself on fire than ever belong. Behind her, a pristine, beige suburban landscape shimmered in the heat, every lawn a perfect green rectangle, every shrub pruned into submission. My land, my 40 acres of rolling hills and wild forest, was an affront to her sense of order. I had just returned from a 2-week trip to D.C., a long, grueling session of budget meetings and bureaucratic knife fights that came with my job as the State Director of Forestry. All I wanted was a cold drink and the quiet company of my trees. Instead, I got this. "Karen," I said, my voice dangerously calm, the way it got when I was a colonel in the army and a young lieutenant was about to make a catastrophic mistake. "For the last time, this is not your property. My fence is stained with a sealant to protect the wood. My mailbox meets federal regulations, and my trees are older than your entire state charter. You have absolutely no jurisdiction here. Please get off my land." She gave a little tittering laugh, a sound like gravel in a blender. "Oh, that's where you're wrong. The runoff from your unkempt forest is discoloring the community retention pond. Your falling pine needles are a fire hazard. We have a responsibility to our residents." She took a step closer, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial whisper, as if letting me in on a secret. "But I can make these fines disappear if you just be a good neighbor and let our landscapers come in and tidy up the property line. Just a little bit. For the firebreak, I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. If a single one of your landscapers sets foot on my property, I will have them arrested for trespassing. If a single one of my trees is harmed, I will hold you and your entire board personally and financially liable for its full appraised value. Do we understand each other?" Her face, which had been a mask of condescending sweetness, hardened into a block of granite. "You'll be hearing from our lawyer," she snapped, turning on her heel and marching back toward the invisible line that separated her beige kingdom from my world of green and brown. That was the last I heard for a month. I assumed my threat, backed by the very clear and legally recorded property markers, had been enough. I was wrong. I was catastrophically, apocalyptically wrong. I came home one Friday afternoon to the sound of chainsaws. Not the distant buzz of a neighbor clearing some brush, but the roaring, guttural scream of multiple industrial saws operating at full throttle, close by. A cold dread, a feeling I hadn't felt since a long-ago firefight in Fallujah, washed over me. I pushed my truck into gear and tore down my long gravel driveway toward the source of the noise. The sight that met me stopped my heart. A crew of 5 men in bright orange vests were systematically felling the heritage grove. My grove, the massive 100-foot-tall longleaf pines, the ancient white oaks that had shaded this land for 2 centuries, were crashing to the earth, one after another, their dying groans drowned out by the scream of machinery. A massive chipper was already devouring their limbs, spitting out a plume of fragrant pulp. And standing there, amidst the carnage, arms crossed, clipboard in hand, was Karen Swanson. She wore a triumphant, venomous smirk. "What in the hell do you think you're doing?" I roared, leaping from my truck before it had even stopped rolling. Karen's smirk widened. "Just tidying up, Mr. Miller." The board voted. It was a clear and present fire hazard. An emergency measure. It's all perfectly legal according to our bylaws. She held up the clipboard as if it were a shield forged by God himself. "You are destroying my property. These trees are protected. I told you what would happen." My voice was shaking with a rage so pure it felt like ice in my veins. One of the crew, a big man with a sweat-stained bandana, shut off his chainsaw. "Hey boss, this the guy?" Karen waved a dismissive hand at him. Don't mind him. He's just a renter. Keep working, boys. We're on a deadline, renter. The word hung in the air, thick with her contempt. She hadn't even bothered to do the most basic property search. She just assumed, because I didn't live in her world of beige stucco and identical mailboxes, I was a nobody, a transient. It was in that moment, seeing the last of the great oaks tremble and fall, its branches reaching for the sky one last time, that the kernel inside me woke up from a long, peaceful sleep. The anger solidified from ice into something much harder, much colder. It became a plan, a meticulous, step-by-step, fully documented plan of annihilation. She had weaponized her petty bylaws and her pathetic little clipboard. I was about to weaponize the full, crushing weight of the state of North Carolina. She thought this was about a scenic view. She had no idea she had just declared war on the forest itself, and on its sworn protector. This is my story. It's a story about what happens when a petty tyrant with a little bit of power messes with the wrong person. It's about property, and it's about respect. But most of all, it's about my trees. If you've ever had a run-in with a power-tripping HOA Karen, hit that subscribe button right now and tell me your nightmare story in the comments below. Let me know where you're watching from, because this kind of madness seems to be everywhere. Now, let's get back to how I prepared to hand-deliver a $23 million invoice for the worst mistake of Karen Swanson's life. Before I was the State Forestry Director, I was Colonel John Miller of the United States Army Corps of Engineers. For 25 years, my life was about structure, planning, and consequences. I built bridges in hostile territory and established bases in deserts where nothing was supposed to grow. My entire career was a testament to the idea that for every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction, and if you fail to plan for that reaction, it will destroy you. When I retired, I didn't want structure anymore. I wanted the opposite. I bought my 40 acres precisely because they were unstructured. The land was raw, a little wild, and dominated by that magnificent stand of old-growth longleaf pine and white oak. It wasn't a forest to be managed. It was a sanctuary to be preserved. My property line abutted the back of Evergreen Estates, a newer development that had clear-cut hundreds of acres of similar forest to build their rows of identical houses. From my porch, I couldn't see them, shielded by the dense wall of green that Karen found so offensive. I knew from the moment I bought the place that the HOA would be a problem. They sent me a welcome packet, which I promptly returned with a polite but firm letter from my lawyer explaining that my parcel was not, and never would be, part of their association. That's when the notices started. Harmless at first. A friendly reminder about lawn maintenance. A suggestion to use their approved trash service. I ignored them. Then they became more aggressive. The warnings about my unsightly gravel driveway. The demands that I trim my trees so the residents of 214 and 216 Primrose Lane could have a better view of the sunset. Each one was met with the same response. A certified letter from my attorney reiterating the legal boundary and advising them to cease and desist all contact. Karen Swanson became president about a year after I moved in. She took the HOA's low-grade hostility and turned it into her personal crusade. She was a woman who had never had any real power in her life, and now, armed with a 3-ring binder of covenants and restrictions, she saw herself as a potentate. She saw my land not as a beautiful natural ecosystem, but as a direct challenge to her authority. It was a patch of chaos bordering her perfect, orderly world, and it drove her insane. I tried to be reasonable. I even attended one of their board meetings early on to introduce myself and explain my philosophy of land management, which was essentially to leave it the hell alone. I explained the ecological importance of the grove, how it was a habitat for native species, how the deep root systems prevented erosion and filtered groundwater. They stared at me with the blank, uncomprehending expressions of people who hear a foreign language. Karen, sitting at the head of the table, simply said, "That's all very nice, but it looks messy." The day they cut my trees down, I didn't shout anymore. I didn't threaten. I became the colonel again. My mind compartmentalized the grief and the rage. They became fuel. This was no longer a dispute with a neighbor. This was a hostile action, an invasion, and it required a precise, overwhelming, and strategic response. As her crew continued their work, their saws screaming, I walked the perimeter. I pulled out my phone and began recording. I filmed every tree falling. I filmed the faces of the crew members. I filmed the deep ruts their heavy equipment was carving into my land. I zoomed in on the license plate of their truck, a beat-up Ford F-350 with a magnetic sign that read, C&G Landscaping, and I filmed Karen, standing there directing them, a smug look of victory on her face. She thought she had won. She was a petty tyrant celebrating the conquest of a tiny, undefended border. She had no concept of the strategic reserves I was about to deploy. She had poked the bear, and now the entire forest was about to fall on her head. I had the law, the science, and the full authority of the state on my side. And I had something she could never understand. A cold, disciplined patience. This wouldn't be a quick victory. It would be a slow, methodical dismantling of her entire world, built piece by piece from the sawdust of my fallen giants. The first 24 hours were about containment and documentation. The local sheriff's deputy who responded to my 911 call was a young kid, barely out of his teens, and clearly intimidated by Karen's aggressive certainty. She brandished her HOA bylaws at him, pointing to the emergency clause about fire mitigation, and he just nodded, completely out of his depth. Ma'am, sir, this seems like a civil matter, he'd said, eager to be anywhere else. I can file a report for property damage, but you'll have to take it up in court. I didn't argue. I knew he was just a pawn. I got his name, his badge number, and the incident report number and let him go. The real work began at dawn the next day. I didn't call a private surveyor. I called my own team. At 0700 hours, 2 state vehicles rolled down my driveway. One was a survey truck from the Department of Environmental Quality, and the other was a vehicle from my own forestry service, carrying Dr. Elena Ramirez, the state's leading botanist and ecological impact specialist. I was not treating this as a personal matter. I was officially initiating a state-level investigation into the illegal destruction of a protected heritage grove. Karen and the residents of Evergreen Estates were about to learn the difference between an angry homeowner and a government agency with subpoena power. For the next 8 hours, my property was a meticulously organized crime scene. The survey crew used GPS and laser transits to formally document the exact property line and the extent of the incursion. They drove stakes with bright orange flags deep into the ground, creating a stark visual boundary between my land and the HOA's common area, a boundary the cutting crew had crossed by nearly 50 feet along a 300-foot front. Every stump was measured, photographed, and numbered. Elena and her assistant took core samples to verify the age of the fallen trees and collected soil samples to assess the damage from the heavy equipment and fluid leaks. I watched her work, her face a mask of professional sorrow. John, these weren't just old trees, she said, running her hand over the massive, splintered base of what had been a 250-year-old white oak. This was a climax community. The soil biome here, the mycorrhizal networks. It will take a century, maybe more, for this to even begin to recover. They didn't just cut down trees. They murdered an entire ecosystem. Her words were clinical, but they validated the deep, burning sense of violation I felt. This wasn't just my property. It was a piece of North Carolina's natural heritage, and Karen had obliterated it for a better view. While they worked, I was on the phone, setting the next phase into motion. I called the head of the state licensing board for contractors. I called the regional office of the Environmental Protection Agency. I called my department's legal counsel. With each call, I wasn't John Miller, the angry guy whose trees got cut down. I was Director Miller, reporting a significant environmental violation. The shift in tone and the immediate, deferential response from every person I spoke to was palpable. The machinery of the state was beginning to turn, slowly at first, but with unstoppable momentum. By midday, we had a preliminary count. 73 trees. Of those, 41 were classified as significant specimens over 50 years old. 12 were confirmed heritage trees, giants over a century old, including the 2.5-century-old patriarch oak that had been the heart of the grove. The sheer scale of the destruction was breathtaking. The monetary value was already climbing into a territory that would make a corporate lawyer sweat. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the scarred earth and the rows of numbered stumps, the survey chief handed me his initial report, a sheaf of papers filled with precise measurements and legal descriptions. Elena gave me her field notes, a grim catalog of the ecological devastation. "The timber value is the least of it," she murmured, looking out at the wasteland. "How do you put a price on something irreplaceable?" I looked at her, the cold fury in my gut now honed to a razor's edge. "You don't," I said, "but you can create a penalty so severe that no one will ever dare to do it again. You can make an example of them." That evening, I sat at my large oak dining table, the same table I'd used to plan military campaigns. I spread out the survey maps, the field notes, the photographs, the state statutes on timber trespass, the Environmental Protection Acts, and the specific laws governing protected groves that I myself had helped draft years ago. The pieces were all there. This wasn't going to be a simple lawsuit. This was going to be a multi-front war. The first salvo would not be a lawyer's letter. It would be an official notice of violation from the state of North Carolina, delivered not just to the HOA, but to every single member on its board personally. They had acted as a group, but liability, I would make sure, was a very personal thing. Karen wanted a firebreak. I was about to bring her a firestorm. My first official communication with the Evergreen Estates HOA post-massacre was not a furious, rambling email or a threatening phone call. It was a 16-page document, printed on the official letterhead of the North Carolina Department of Forestry, bound with a cover sheet, and delivered via a professional courier who required a signature upon receipt. A copy was sent to the HOA's corporate address, and individual copies were sent to the personal home addresses of Karen Swanson and the other 4 members of the board of directors. I wanted them to receive it not as a faceless board, but as individuals sitting at their own kitchen tables. I wanted them to feel the weight of what was coming for them personally. The document was titled, "Official Notice of Violation and Demand for Remediation." It was cold, clinical, and utterly terrifying in its bureaucratic precision. It began by citing the specific state laws that had been violated: timber trespass, willful destruction of state-protected flora, violation of the Soil and Water Conservation Act, and operating heavy machinery in a riparian buffer zone without a permit. Each citation was followed by a detailed explanation of the infraction, cross-referenced with the evidence my teams had gathered. The survey maps were included as Exhibit A, showing the indisputable incursion onto my property. The full botanical report, detailing the age, species, and ecological significance of each of the 73 destroyed trees, was Exhibit B. High-resolution photographs of the damage, the stumps, and the equipment ruts were Exhibit C. I didn't mention my personal ownership of the property until page 3. For the first 2 pages, the document was framed as the state investigating a complaint from a landowner, lending it an air of impartial official authority. Then I laid it out. I detailed my attempts to communicate with the board, referencing the certified letters my attorney had sent, establishing a clear record of their awareness of the property boundaries and my refusal to allow them access. This systematically dismantled their potential defense that it was an honest mistake. The core of the document was the preliminary damage assessment. This is where I knew the coffee would be spit across a few pristine granite countertops in Evergreen Estates. I broke it down into 4 categories. First, the timber value. Using the standard Doyle log rule, the commercial value of the lumber was calculated at approximately $85,000. Then, I cited the state's timber trespass statute, which mandates treble damages for willful and intentional destruction. That brought the total to $255,000. Second, the cost of replacement and restoration. This is where it got astronomical. You can't replace a 250-year-old oak. The law, however, provides a formula for calculating the value of such trees based on their size, species, condition, and location. Using the official trunk formula method endorsed by the Council of Tree and Landscape Appraisers, Elena and I calculated the appraised value of the 12 heritage trees alone at just over $14 million. The cost to remediate the soil damage, remove the invasive species that would now flourish, and attempt to replant with mature saplings added another $350,000. Third, the punitive fines levied by the state for the environmental violations. The destruction of protected flora carried a fine of up to $10,000 per tree. I calculated it for the 12 heritage trees, totaling $120,000. The soil and water violations added another $50,000. Finally, I added a section on loss of ecological services. This was a newer legal concept, but one that was gaining traction and one I had personally advocated for. It assigned a monetary value to the services the forest provided for free: carbon sequestration, air and water filtration, wildlife habitat, and stormwater control. I conservatively estimated this value over the next 50 years, discounted to present day, at $125,000. The grand total, printed in bold at the bottom of page 12, was $2,300,000. The final pages detailed the demand. The HOA had 30 days to remit payment in full to the State Environmental Remediation Fund. Failure to do so would result in the state placing a lien on all HOA common properties and pursuing further legal action against the association and, if warranted, its board members individually for gross negligence and breach of fiduciary duty. I pictured Karen receiving this. I imagined her tearing open the envelope, her face confident, expecting a blustering letter from my personal injury lawyer. I saw her eyes scanning the official letterhead, a flicker of confusion. Then her eyes landing on the final number. The way the blood would drain from her face. The way her little world of fines for mismatched mailboxes would suddenly crumble under the weight of a multi-million-dollar state action. The response came a week later. It was from a downtown law firm, not the small-town lawyer they usually used. This one had a lot more partners listed on the letterhead. The tone was dramatically different. Gone was the arrogance and dismissal. It was replaced with a cautious, legalistic language that signaled they knew they were in serious trouble. The letter stated that the board was reviewing the state's notice and took these allegations very seriously. It claimed the board had acted in good faith, based on the advice of their landscape contractor regarding a fire risk. It was a weak, transparent attempt to shift the blame. They were already trying to find a scapegoat. The letter concluded by requesting a meeting to discuss a possible resolution. They wanted to negotiate. They thought they could sit down, offer to replant a few saplings, maybe pay a modest fine, and make this go away. They still didn't understand. I wasn't a disgruntled homeowner they could placate. I was the director of the agency that was holding a gun to their head, and I had no intention of lowering it. My response, sent via my department's general counsel, was brief. The state does not negotiate on violations of this magnitude. The demand for $23 million is firm. However, Director Miller is willing to meet with the board to discuss the specific payment and remediation schedule. I had them hooked. They were terrified of the number, but the offer of a meeting gave them a sliver of hope. It was a classic interrogation technique. Apply overwhelming pressure, then offer a small, controlled release to encourage compliance. I was going to let them walk into that meeting thinking they could talk their way out of it. And then, I was going to show them the full, documented evidence of Karen's personal culpability, and watch them tear each other apart. While the HOA and its new, expensive lawyers were scrambling, I opened a second front. Karen's power was derived from the consent, or at least the apathy, of the other homeowners in Evergreen Estates. I knew that if they understood that her personal vendetta was about to cost each of them thousands of dollars in special assessments, she would lose that support instantly. But I couldn't just send them a letter. That would look like a personal attack. I needed to build a coalition from within. I started with a walk around my own property, on the roads that bordered the pristine development. I was looking for signs of dissent, for houses that didn't quite fit the beige mold. I found one a few blocks from the disaster zone. It had a discreet aura sticker from the Marine Corps on the mailbox. A flag, properly lit, flew day and night. The lawn was neat, but not obsessively so. I ran the address through the public tax records. The owner was a Mark Jensen, a retired Marine Master Gunnery Sergeant. Perfect. I found him in his garage, meticulously cleaning a set of golf clubs. He was a compact, powerful man in his late 50s with a no-nonsense look in his eyes. I introduced myself not as the forestry director, but as his neighbor John Miller, the retired Army colonel. There's an immediate unspoken bond between career military men, regardless of branch. We speak the same language of discipline and respect. I saw the sticker, I said. Army Corps of Engineers, he nodded, his eyes appraising me. Master Gunnery Sergeant, Marines. Heard what happened over on your property line. Damn shame. I looked at him directly. It was more than a shame, Gunny. It was a deliberate act of destruction orchestrated by your HOA president. He stopped polishing a 5-iron and leaned against his workbench. Tell me something I don't know, Colonel. Karen Swanson is a one-woman reign of terror. She's been running this place like her own personal fiefdom for 2 years. Most folks are too scared of her fines and her public shaming to stand up to her. He told me he was on the HOA board. He'd run for the position hoping to be a voice of reason, but he was consistently outvoted 4-1 by Karen and her loyal cronies. 2 sycophantic women and a timid accountant who just did whatever Karen told him to. I voted against the firebreak. For the record, Mark said, his jaw tight. I told them it was a massive overreach, that we needed a proper survey and your express written permission. Karen railroaded it through. Claimed she had a verbal agreement with you. She lied point-blank in an official board meeting. This was gold. A witness from inside the boardroom. Would you be willing to sign an affidavit to that effect? I asked. Mark's eyes narrowed. What's your play here, Colonel? You suing them? I'm beyond suing, Mark. The state of North Carolina is levying a $2.3 million fine against the HOA for this. It's official. The demand letter went out last week. The golf club clattered to the concrete floor. Mark stared at me, his mouth slightly agape. 2.3 million? He did the math in his head. There are 200 homes in this development. That's $11,500 per household. That's the opening number, I said grimly. And it's non-negotiable. A slow grin spread across the master gunnery sergeant's face. Oh, you beautiful bastard, he breathed. You're not just suing her, you're sinking her entire battleship. He picked up his club. An affidavit? Colonel, I will testify under oath in a court of law. I'll give you the minutes from that meeting. I'll give you everything you need. Mark became my inside man. He pointed me to other residents who had been terrorized by Karen. I spent the next week having quiet, discreet conversations. I met with Mrs. Gable, an elderly widow whose prize-winning rose bushes, which had won awards at the state fair for a decade, were ripped out by the HOA's landscapers because they weren't on the approved shrubbery list. I talked to the Rodriguez family, a young couple with 3 kids who were facing $5,000 in fines because their son's wooden swing set was deemed an unapproved permanent structure. Each one of them had a story of Karen's petty tyranny, of rules being invented on the spot, of public humiliation at board meetings. They were all afraid, isolated, and beaten down. I didn't ask them to join a lawsuit or protest. I just listened, and then I explained, calmly and factually, what was happening. I told them about the state's action. I showed them the math. I explained that their insurance was unlikely to cover an intentional act of trespass and destruction, meaning the $23 million would come directly from their pockets. Fear is a powerful motivator, but financial ruin is a far greater one. The seeds of rebellion were sown. The quiet discontent that had been simmering under the surface of Evergreen Estates was about to boil over. The final piece of my internal strategy was to neutralize the HOA's legal defenses. They were already trying to blame the landscaping company. So, I paid a visit to C&G Landscaping. It wasn't a company. It was one guy, Carl, operating out of a shed behind his house with a couple of day laborers. When I pulled up in my official state vehicle, he looked like he'd seen a ghost. I didn't threaten him. I laid out his reality. His company was unlicensed for commercial logging operations. He had violated 6 environmental regulations. He was operating without the proper insurance or permits. The state could fine him into oblivion and revoke his business license permanently. Or he could cooperate. She told me she had permission, he stammered, sweat beading on his forehead. She showed me the HOA rules, said it was an emergency. Did she give you those instructions in writing, Carl? I asked quietly. He hesitated. Then he walked into his cluttered office and came back with a piece of paper. It was a work order, signed by Karen Swanson. At the bottom, in the special instructions section, was a handwritten note. It read, "Clear all trees and brush up to the old fence line. Ignore property stakes. Homeowner is a renter and has been notified. Expedite for fire safety." It was the smoking gun. Willful, explicit instruction to ignore the property boundaries. A blatant lie about my status as a renter. It was everything I needed to pierce the corporate veil of the HOA and go after Karen personally. I made a copy of the work order and left Carl with a promise that if he was fully cooperative, the state might be lenient regarding his own violations. He was more than happy to agree. I now had an internal witness on the board, a growing rebellion among the residents, and irrefutable proof that this was not a mistake by a contractor, but a malicious act ordered by one person. The stage was set for the meeting. Karen and her board were walking into an ambush, and they had absolutely no idea. The meeting was scheduled to take place in the Evergreen Estates community clubhouse, a sterile, beige room that smelled faintly of chlorine and desperation. The HOA's lawyer, a slick-looking man named Henderson whose suit probably cost more than my first car, had insisted on it being a small, private affair with just the board and myself. To facilitate a productive dialogue, I agreed, but I had one condition. My department's general counsel, Tom Riley, would be accompanying me, and I insisted that the meeting be formally recorded, with a court stenographer present, to ensure a clear and accurate record of the proceedings. Henderson reluctantly agreed, though I could hear the suspicion in his voice. He thought I was just posturing. He was wrong. I was building a legal case, and this meeting was where the defendants would condemn themselves with their own words. Tom and I arrived exactly on time. I was in a simple suit and tie, no uniform, no Forestry Service logos. I wanted them to see me as the man whose land they had ravaged before I reminded them of the power I now wielded. The 5 board members were seated on one side of a long conference table. Karen was in the center, looking smug and defiant. Henderson sat beside her, shuffling a thick pile of papers. Mark Jensen, my inside man, sat at the far end, his face an unreadable mask of military discipline. He gave me a barely perceptible nod as I entered. After the initial, awkward pleasantries, Henderson cleared his throat and began. "Mr. Miller, Director Miller," he began, correcting himself, "we are all here in the spirit of cooperation to find an amicable resolution to this unfortunate misunderstanding." He slid a folder across the table. "The board has authorized me to make a settlement offer. In recognition of the boundary confusion, the HOA is prepared to pay for the full cost of stump removal and the replanting of 50 mature pine saplings. Furthermore, they will make a goodwill donation of $25,000 to the State Parks Fund." He sat back, a self-satisfied smile on his face, as if he had just offered a king's ransom. I didn't even look at the folder. I looked directly at Karen. "A misunderstanding?" I said, my voice quiet but carrying across the silent room. "Was it a misunderstanding when you repeatedly sent me notices about trees that were not on your property? Was it a misunderstanding when I had my attorney send you certified letters confirming the property boundaries? Was it a misunderstanding when I personally told you, to your face, that you had no jurisdiction and that I would hold you liable for any damage?" Karen bristled. "We were acting on the advice of our landscape professionals about a clear fire hazard. We have a duty to protect our community. A fire hazard that has not been noted by any state or county fire marshal in the last 50 years? I countered. "A fire hazard that conveniently required clear-cutting a perfect view to the sunset for the 2 homes behind my property, one of which, I believe, belongs to your fellow board member, Mrs. Albright?" Mrs. Albright, a woman with a tight perm and a perpetually sour expression, flushed a deep red. Henderson jumped back in. "My client's motivations are not the issue here. The fact is, a mistake was made by the contractor." "No," I said, cutting him off sharply. I slid a document across the table. It was a crystal-clear copy of the work order, with Karen's handwritten instructions at the bottom. "No mistake was made by the contractor, Mr. Henderson. He was following a direct, written order, signed by your client, Ms. Swanson. An order which explicitly instructed him to ignore property stakes and which falsely identified me as a renter. This was not a mistake. It was a malicious, premeditated act of property destruction. The air went out of the room. Henderson stared at the paper, his slick composure cracking. The other board members leaned in to look, their eyes wide. Karen's face went white. "Where did you get that?" she stammered. That's privileged information. It's evidence." Tom Riley, my counsel, said, speaking for the first time. His voice was a low, gravelly baritone that commanded attention. "And it will be Exhibit A in the state's lawsuit against the HOA for willful destruction, and potentially in a separate civil suit against Ms. Swanson personally for tortious interference and gross negligence." Mark Jensen then chose his moment perfectly. He cleared his throat. "I'd also like the record to show," he said, his voice ringing with authority, "that I formally objected to this action in the board meeting of October 12th. I stated that it was illegal and reckless. Ms. Swanson assured the board she had a verbal agreement from Mr. Miller and that the renter story was just a way to motivate the contractor. She lied to this board to pursue a personal vendetta." The other three board members, the two sycophants and the timid accountant, turned to stare at Karen, their expressions a mixture of horror and betrayal. They were realizing that she hadn't just exposed the HOA to liability. She had lied to them, making them complicit in her crime. They were on the hook, personally, for $23 million because of her. "This is an outrage," Karen shrieked, finding her voice. "This is a conspiracy. You're all trying to protect him. The only person who needs protection, Ms. Swanson, is you, from the consequences of your own actions," I said, my voice like ice. "The state's offer is not a settlement. It is a bill. $2.3 million. We can discuss a payment plan, but the amount is not up for debate. And that's just the bill for the HOA. My personal civil suit against you, for the diminished value of my property and emotional distress, has yet to be filed." Henderson was frantically whispering to Karen, trying to get her to shut up, but she was too far gone. She stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "You can't do this. I am the president. I will not be intimidated." Tom Riley looked at her, his expression bored. "Ma'am, please sit down. You are making things worse for yourself." But she didn't. She pointed a trembling finger at me. "You think you're so powerful with your fancy title. But we have rights. We will fight this. We will countersue you for harassment." It was the final, desperate act of a petty tyrant who had just realized her power was an illusion. She had ruled her little kingdom through bluff and bluster, and she had just run headfirst into a man who didn't bluff, who held all the cards, and who had just laid them, one by one, on the table. The meeting was over. She just didn't know it yet. The implosion had begun. The aftermath of that meeting was swift and brutal. The illusion of Karen's authority, built on a foundation of bluster and fear, shattered in an instant. The other board members, now staring down the barrel of personal financial ruin, turned on her with the ferocity of cornered animals. Before Tom and I had even reached the parking lot, we could hear raised voices from the clubhouse. Mark called me later that evening. "It was a bloodbath, Colonel," he said, a note of grim satisfaction in his voice. "Henderson told them in no uncertain terms that the game was up. The work order you produced was an extinction-level event for their legal defense. He said their only option was to mitigate the damage, which meant throwing Karen under the bus, and the board, with Henderson's guidance, had immediately voted to strip Karen of her presidency and suspend her from the board pending an internal investigation, a transparent move to legally distance themselves from her actions. They formally censured her for acting outside of her authority and for willfully misleading the board. The two women who had been her staunchest allies were the first to vote against her, desperate to save their own skins. The timid accountant, apparently terrified of the words fiduciary duty, practically sprinted to second the motion. Karen had stormed out, vowing revenge, but her reign was over. The locks on the HOA office were changed within the hour. But removing Karen was only the first step for the beleaguered board. They were still on the hook for a $23 million bill. The news spread through Evergreen Estates like wildfire. Mark, using the resident email list, sent out a summary of the situation. He didn't editorialize. He just stated the facts. The illegal clear-cutting, the state's official violation notice, the $23 million demand, and the irrefutable evidence that it was all due to the unauthorized actions of Karen Swanson. He attached a copy of the state's demand letter. Panic ensued. The community Facebook group, once a sleepy forum for posting about lost cats and complaining about garbage collection, exploded. People were doing the math, realizing that the emergency firebreak was going to cost them each a five-figure sum. The anger directed at me, which Karen had tried to stir up, vanished. It refocused, with laser-like intensity, on the woman who had brought this catastrophe upon them. I made my next move public. I had my department issue an official press release. Again, it was dry, factual, and professional. It detailed the destruction of a protected heritage grove, the state's ongoing investigation, and the significant fines levied against the responsible parties. I gave a single quote to the local news reporter who called me. Our department has a sworn duty to protect the natural resources of the state for all its citizens. When that trust is violated so egregiously, we will use every tool at our disposal to ensure accountability. The story was on the front page of the local paper the next day and was the lead story on the evening news. The headline was perfect. HOA faces millions in fines after destroying state-protected forest. The media, naturally, loved the narrative. A power-mad HOA Karen versus a quiet veteran protecting his land. Reporters started camping out in front of Karen's house. She was no longer the queen of her cul-de-sac. She was a pariah. The HOA's insurance company, after reviewing the evidence, particularly the work order, formally denied their claim in a blistering letter that cited the intentional and malicious acts exclusion clause in their policy. This was the final nail in the coffin. The money would have to come directly from the homeowners. Henderson, the HOA's lawyer, called my counsel, Tom, in a state of near-total capitulation. His clients were ready to surrender unconditionally. They wanted to discuss the settlement I had mentioned. My price for that settlement was simple and had two parts. First, the HOA would issue a formal public apology to me and to the community for its gross negligence. Second, Karen Swanson had to be held accountable. I wanted them to file a civil suit against her to recoup the damages, forcing her to bear the financial burden of her actions. It was a masterful stroke on Tom's part. It wasn't just about the money. It was about forcing the very organization that had enabled her to be the instrument of her final downfall. The board, eager to show the residents they were taking action and to mitigate their own liability, agreed immediately. They hired a new law firm and filed a multimillion-dollar lawsuit against their former president for breach of fiduciary duty, fraud, and gross negligence. Karen Swanson, who had built her empire on frivolous fines and threatening letters from lawyers, was now buried under an avalanche of the very same paper she had used to terrorize others. Her perfect, orderly world had been systematically, legally, and publicly dismantled. The community she had sought to control with an iron fist had turned on her completely. Her name was now a local punchline, a cautionary tale of hubris and arrogance. And I still hadn't collected a single dime. That was the next and final phase of my plan. Not just to punish, but to restore. With Karen neutralized and the HOA board desperate to make amends, the final negotiations began. Henderson was gone, replaced by a more sensible, less ostentatious lawyer named David Chun, who represented the new, chastened board, now led by Mark Jensen. The first thing Chun did was call my counsel and express the board's profound regret and their desire to find a restorative solution. They knew they couldn't possibly pay the full $23 million. A special assessment of that size would bankrupt many residents and crater property values for everyone. It would destroy the community, and despite my anger, that was not my ultimate goal. My goal was justice for the forest. The state is not an entity that prioritizes profit, Mr. Chun. I told him when we finally met, this time in my office downtown. It prioritizes conservation and stewardship. The monetary figure on that notice is a reflection of the value of what was lost. It is not a starting point for a negotiation in the traditional sense. However, the state is willing to consider alternative forms of restitution. I laid out my proposal. It was something I had been working on since the day I saw the stumps. The HOA would pay a significantly reduced, but still painful monetary fine of $300,000. This was non-negotiable and would cover the state's investigative costs and fund a number of smaller reforestation projects elsewhere in the county. It was a number high enough to be a serious punishment and a deterrent, but not high enough to bankrupt the community. The real payment, however, would not be in cash. It would be in land. Evergreen Estates had a 10-acre parcel of community green space that sat at the back of the development, adjacent to my own ravaged property line. It was mostly just manicured lawn, a few ornamental pear trees, and a gazebo. It was ecologically useless. My proposal was that the HOA would cede this 10-acre parcel, in its entirety, to the state. It would be placed into a conservation land trust, managed by the Department of Forestry in perpetuity. It would be legally protected from any future development, and its purpose would be to serve as a reforestation and ecological education site. We would replant it not with ornamental shrubs, but with native longleaf pines, oaks, hickories, and other species that belong there. We would restore the land to what it was before it was an HOA. Mark and the board were stunned. They had expected a brutal negotiation over dollars and cents. I was offering them a way to not only pay their debt but to create a positive legacy out of their catastrophic mistake. They would lose their manicured green space, but they would gain a beautiful natural forest preserve at their back door, one that would grow and mature for generations, increasing their property values in the long run and serving as a permanent, living reminder of the importance of respecting nature. It was an offer they couldn't refuse. From a purely financial standpoint, giving up the land was far cheaper than paying the full fine. From a public relations standpoint, it was a godsend. They could frame it as a forward-thinking move, a partnership with the state to promote conservation. They agreed on the spot. The final piece of the puzzle was Karen. The HOA's lawsuit against her moved forward. Faced with overwhelming evidence and abandoned by everyone, her legal defense crumbled. Her homeowner's insurance refused to cover her, just as it had for the HOA. She was forced to sell her house, the one with the perfect lawn and the approved mailbox, to pay for her legal fees and the initial settlement with the HOA. The final amount she would have to pay would likely garnish her wages and retirement for the rest of her life. She was financially and socially ruined. The final confrontation wasn't in a courtroom or a boardroom. It was a few months later. I was out on the newly acquired state land, overseeing the first community planting day. We had dozens of volunteers, including many residents from Evergreen Estates, Mark, the Rodriguez family, even old Mrs. Gable, who was happily showing a group of children how to properly plant a pine sapling. The mood was one of hope and renewal. A moving truck was parked in front of Karen's old house down the street. As I watched my new neighbors, my former adversaries, working together to heal the scar on the land, I saw her. She was carrying a box out to the truck, her face pale and drawn. She looked up and saw me. She saw the crowd of volunteers, the hundreds of new trees being planted, the transformation of her former kingdom. Our eyes met across the distance. There was no anger left in her expression, only a hollowed-out emptiness. She had lost everything, not because of me, but because of her own petty need for control. She couldn't stand the sight of a single tree that didn't follow her rules, and in the end, the forest had won. I didn't gloat. I didn't even smile. I just gave her a slow, deliberate nod, a final acknowledgement. Then I turned back to the work, picked up a shovel, and helped a young boy plant a new white oak, not far from the stump of the giant his predecessor had destroyed. Justice isn't always about punishment. Sometimes it's about restoration. It's about taking something broken and making it whole again. Karen had tried to impose her sterile, artificial order on the natural world. But the natural world is patient. It adapts, it endures, and it always, eventually, grows back stronger.